But as a special treat, we get to hear from Elizabeth Alexander, who I have had the pleasure of introducing several times. And in the past, I had a standard introduction, which Elizabeth, you may remember, went on for 5 pages. And what, it was an experiment. What I attempted to do was to enumerate every journal that Elizabeth had published in. And I did an introduction 1 year and did the introduction 2 years later. The list got longer, and I thought, I just can't do this. But more importantly, one doesn't need to do this because of the ways in which we all know Elizabeth Alexander. And for this conference, for this symposium, we were particularly happy that she agreed to speak because of the relationship between scholarship and the production of art, the ways in which Elizabeth is both a scholar and a poet. And as we think about new genres for an imagined future for African American studies, I do hope that art plays an important role, and that we imagine new forms for representing experience. Or maybe we won't represent experience, new forms for collecting and sharing experience. Most of you are familiar with Elizabeth Alexander's poetry from the Venus Hottentot to Crave Radiance. And if you haven't gotten the anthology Crave Radiance, you should. It's new and selected poetry and allows us to get a sense of the overall trajectory of Elizabeth's career. It's amazing. Elizabeth, most recently, has been the chair of African American Studies at Yale. And it's just amazing that people are in administrative positions and continue to be so productive. And one of the things that I think is so important about Elizabeth's work is the prose writing, which stylistically certainly is art. We have wonderful essays about the African American literary tradition, for example, and the work suggests the ways in which, again, art and scholarship might be melded, but also, we were talking about audience briefly, the ways in which scholarship creates an audience can be artful, and that we can understand the relationship between the two. Anyway, I won't go on because I want to hear what Elizabeth has to say, so please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Alexander.
Hi, everybody. Hi. Really, really wonderful to be here. We were listening to Bebop Betty Carter, and there is no one-to-one correspondence with my playing that, except I did one little theme music, which I think is always a good thing. Except that I wanted to call us together with music. And what we heard was Stay As Sweet As You Are, which is from the song It's Not About the Melody, which seemed to me to be a kind of overriding epistemology for part of what I've tried to do today. I'm not listening for, trying to make the melody. What I'm trying to do is listen and gather on the lower frequencies in the way that Betty Carter does so extraordinarily. I think also what Betty Carter reminds me of, and what our great musicians always let us know and remember and experience, is the absolutely nuanced and articulate truth of voice that we hear in her music, that we strive for in our own work. Thank you, IRAAS brothers and sisters, for inviting me today. I'm very, very honored that I could be here with you and that I could speak on this really wonderful occasion. And I want to continue to think, along with the conversations today, which were so amazing, about where we stand and how we will walk the walk forward. Your community here is, as you know, an extraordinary one, peopled with some of the folks that I most admire in head and heart in this world. And you always have to thank your teachers. So Marcellus Blount, when he was but a child, he actually was a child. He was very young when he went through school, was my TA for American Literature 1850 to 1900. And so that is... Thank you, teacher. I think that also seeing you and being with all of you today, I'm very happily reminded that who we choose to be within this work, we are a fellowship, a sister and brotherhood of interlocutors, and I feel extremely fortunate to be in that number. To be here amongst friends old and new from across the many years, beginning with 30 years forward, reminds me that walking this road as a scholar of the people of the African diaspora has been the greatest gift I could imagine. More than just a professional gift, a soul gift. The ideas, the minds, the discoveries, the struggle, the stakes, and you all, the people. I kept thinking as I was preparing to speak with you, we are a freedom-loving people. That's what I wanted to say. We are a freedom-loving people. And so I want to, in part, remind us of the stakes of the work that we're doing, how and why we must protect and move it forward and collectively face our challenges. There are a lot of ideas in here, a lot of wonderful modal shifts, and in the work that I'm presenting today that is in many ways very confluent with what Professor Perry just described. I'm doing what she described at the very end. And also with Professor Allen's comments, you know, Black feminist studies has shown me how to do what I'm doing here. And I want to leave time for us to talk together afterwards. I played Betty Carter also because I wanted to frame this talk with an evocative reminder of all that Black music does for us, no matter what our specialty. A friend said to me the other day, why don't the white people play music at their book parties? And I took, that's a very philosophical question. It was a real question. And I took from this a wish to remember to do it like we do wherever we go. And that may mean many things, from our style politics to our affects to the home spaces we bring with us. I don't understand why you don't all wear gowns when you give your talks. Who said that? Our beloved friend Paul Rogers said that to Farah and Saidia Hartman and myself. Why don't you girls wear gowns when you give your academic talks? I don't get it. If you could, why wouldn't you? It's appropriate. When we were all starting out in the profession. So no gown today, but theme music, and a reminder that when we come to the academy, when we inhabit this space where we were not supposed to be and when we're still not often welcome, when we inhabit it, when we transform it, that we will only do so well if we come, in Shangai's words, with all of our stuff. So I've put my remarks together as a 10-point platform, which is actually 12, but I wanted to make an illusion. For what I think we need to think about as we move ahead. Many of us are doing this, many of us are doing other things. There'll be time to speak about this. So here are 10 things, but it goes on a piece, that I think scholars of African American studies can do to perpetuate our field, best practices, if you will. 1, the future of African American studies should not be in the hands of capricious administrators, but it is, and we need to take it back. And I'm echoing what Professor Patillo said earlier today. We need to lay our bodies down on those resources and do not let them go. They will evaporate or they will be taken if you don't guard every penny. Guard. We're not even in the academy, I don't think, dealing with Motown liberals anymore. Those white people are not in charge now. I think that we're seeing the starvation death of the humanities, which I think also signals that our field could become, and in some places has become, obsolete. Whatever little autonomy we have could be overturned in a flash, absorbed into a liberalism that shrinks the humanities and wants to believe in fictions of post-raciality. This is what's at hand if we're not vigilant, I promise you. And so, a kind of radical leadership is what's called for, leaders who can move forward with vision and excellence, but also with fight, real, actual, true fight. Even if you aren't an administrator then, I say wage administrative battle. The administrators of color who do this work cannot do it alone, and their voices can be tuned out too easily. I chaired Yale's African American Studies Department for 4 years with pride and purpose every second that I served. And Jonathan Holloway is now continuing that hard work, and I'm enjoying a sabbatical. And so also the beginning of that sabbatical has given me a chance to think back through 4 years of unfinished things that have preoccupied me that I'm going to be speaking about today. We transformed many things in the department, made hires junior and senior, some of whom are here, stabilized our own administrative scaffolding, refocused our graduate program and curriculum, brought in major donors for lectures and research travel for faculty and students, established a regular Vital Works in Progress series, and more. Perhaps most importantly, we put the administration on notice that we were letting nary a penny nor a resource go, even in a financial crisis, and that the racism that pervaded so many of our exchanges with colleagues, some with whom we work jointly, that racism would be regularly called out and named insistently. And so what is success? It's never complete, but we joined together as a department and refocused our purpose and sense of fight, while also revitalizing our sense, I think, of the joy in the work that we together do. And so as my sabbatical began, and I would still get chairs emails that I would then send on to poor Jonathan, I would think with just a little distance, I would think they will make clerks of us if we let them. This is not just true in African American studies, but the stakes are higher because, as you know, we are newer, we are more vulnerable, we are more expendable. I also thought often of Allison's Invisible Man and the letter, "Keep this nigger boy running." And so I read to you from this memo that I wrote, one of thousands, to give you a sense of what I've been writing for 4 years and what I mean by fight. Dear X, I am dismayed at your relentless attempts to diminish our senior administrators' hours from 12 months, as was advertised, to 10 months. You say we will take this one step at a time, but likewise I am disappointed that we will have to reevaluate the business help we get from X in 6 months. The major problem is that I have spent countless hours on matters that are in the end of little cost to Yale. One step at a time and reevaluating extend a process that has gone on for 4 years. I have been attempting to get adequate levels of staff in our office my entire term as chair. At the last meeting, we discussed the particular demands of being an interdisciplinary department. Because we regularly interface with 12 other departments, we must know the personnel structure and functions of those other units as we interact with them. I can't help but feel that the university is not accounting for faculty time in the correct way, when faculty is occupied on staffing issues over 4 years. The point is that something is terribly out of whack when faculty have to spend so much time over such petty issues again and again and again. This damages the university and our diminished productivity, not to mention the fact that it will be difficult to convince productive faculty to chair or serve in any administrative capacities in the future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I am copying the president on down, and this was one where the entire faculty signed. So the corollary of 1, which is about fight and relentlessness, is know when to escalate and know when to pull back. 2, take 15 minutes twice a year to write a paragraph about something in the news that you know a lot about, and then figure out how to disseminate it. When the press calls, we are mostly busy, we're in the midst, we're not on their schedule, we don't get to it in time. But then, of course, we leave the field to the fools. Race is everywhere, as we know, but there is precious little light shed on it, and obviously, I mean, you know, many amongst us here, Doreen Warren, so many of you are in this public talk business, but I'm suggesting that all of us, twice a year, ought to put our voices in that regard. And I think that entering the fray in the way that I suggest lets us control a little bit better our own time and how we enter. When the Trayvon Martin tragedy was unfolding, and when the sorry, wretched verdict came in, I struggled, as so many of us did, with my own young people. What to tell, so many of us asked our young men. The work of Mark Anthony Neal informed my thinking. Phil Goff's sobering work on perceived stereotype informed my thinking. His assertion that witnesses see and guess the ages of black boys as being on average 4 years older than they are, making my 14 and 15-year-old boys men in the eyes of those around them in New Haven, Connecticut, where we toggle between the out-of-control homicide rate for young black men. It is more dangerous to be a young black man in New Haven than in New York, along with my very neighbors writing on the block watch, quote, black boys seen on bicycles, and, quote, call 911 if a black boy comes on your porch and rings your doorbell. This in a campaign season when my children were canvassing for our favored mayoral candidate. So I bring this up to say I didn't do what I've counseled and get my thoughts out when that happened, but I did put some thoughts down because I continued to hear in my head Gwendolyn Brooks's phrase, where black is not beloved. In the poem In the Mecca, there's a 5-year-old girl, a character named Pepita, who is murdered. And the Brooksian tragic twist is encompassed when she writes that Pepita never went to kindergarten and thus never learned that black is not beloved. So the positive twist on the death of this 5-year-old girl child is that she never had to learn that she was not beloved. And I would watch my children playing basketball, listen to how they would deepen their 13-year-old voices to holler, ball, and listen to their coach tell my sons, get large, and think of his Eritrean father who told him, never be smaller than you are. Be large. What is the rule of the street? Be large, be small. Some men are told they need to make themselves less intimidating. They need to fold in their very selves. And the fundamental contradiction that Trayvon's situation exemplifies, too large, you intimidate, but how else to be a man? Too small is only in the mind. You are still large. You are still male. You are still black. You are still beautiful. I watch how they intimidate each other on purpose on the basketball court, how they enact their masculinity in each other's faces, controlled aggression that sometimes bursts over and then is managed. I watch them knock each other down and help each other up. I watch them master the codes of the court and the street. I watch them practice their little swag. They are smelling themselves, as the expression goes, literally smelling their funk, feeling the possibilities of their maleness that I think is the greatest and most beautiful thing in the world. I watch their splendiferous gloating when they make a three-pointer, how they yell, beast, to each other when they snatch a rebound. And I watch how they give each other skin for a job well done. Black skin, this fellowship of beautiful young men, learning to be mighty together inside this gym. Learning to be large, skilled, savvy, intimidating young black men living fully in their physicality. I see you, they say, to a job well done, a radiant smile, index finger to the eye. I see you, my brother, my son. 3, do something by your own example to model spiritual and physical health to your peers and the young people in your community who are watching you. And here I'm talking about the community of the School of African American Studies. That might mean the Valerie Smith example that I've always loved about how in her years at UCLA, she still may do this, she would take dissertation meetings with her students on 6 a.m. hikes in the LA mountains. If you want my full and undivided time, come hike with me at 6 in the morning, she would say. Or it might be not sending emails to students and junior colleagues at midnight and then at 3 a.m. and then at 5 a.m. even if you are awake. And if I ever did that, I'm really sorry. But we are trying to stay alive. We are trying to stay alive. Literally, the cataclysm of black, male, middle-class, middle-aged catastrophic death, asthma, heart attack, stroke, is not something I need to school you about. The disproportionate rates of stress-related illness amongst middle-aged, middle-class black women, cancers, other unwellnesses. We need to model good health. We need to remind each other of how to be healthy together. And for that also, I say thank you. I say thank you to my friends and colleagues. Thank you to Farah for walks. Thank you, Alondra, for saying, shut it down. Shut it down. Thank you to Jafari and to Marcus for hugs in the middle of the day for no reason whatsoever. This is what we need to do for each other. One of the things that I didn't do as chair, but wanted to do, I'll tell you a lot of things I wanted to do because then maybe someone will pick it up and do it, or maybe I'll do it another time, is to have a Friday morning yoga class for everyone in the department. We serve too much food because that's how we do, you know. But I did change our food to much, 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 much healthier food, and so I'm happy about that. So model spiritual and physical health to each other. 4, make sure our students are continually in the archive and on the demographic ethnographic trail. Okay, so, you know, just steer them away from this like third-hand work, you know, and for work that is ephemeral. And I won't get started on what that might be, but you know, there are some silly projects we need to really discourage our students from doing. They're excited and they're engaged, and I'm excited, you know, like I could talk about scandal all day and all night, but I don't want a dissertation on scandal. Not yet. I don't think there's enough to write a dissertation on scandal. So, not when we haven't yet gone to the archive, not even with the presence of Joe Morton now. Must you be so mediocre? I could act it all out for you, but I shan't. So here's the point of the archive and ethnography. We don't even yet know who we are or who we've been, and we mustn't get distracted from the knowing that has been kept from us for so long. Marcellus asked that I speak a little bit about some really exciting work I've been doing, so just a few words on a prehistory of African American studies. All of the recent national commemorations of the 40th anniversary of African American studies showcased a very important tale that was spoken about earlier today, the student activist impulse for African American studies, in Yale's case in the late 60s, but we heard from Professor Patillo some of those student struggles that happened later on. And that is very important, but a little while into the 40th celebrations, I began to shift course and emphasize the obvious but neglected fact. And again, Professor Patillo pointed us in that direction. I thought African American Studies started in 1915. While we were marking the history of the field in program and department form at predominantly white universities, okay, right? But the contributions of people of African descent to the field as subject and epistemology is much, much older. Further back even, I would say, to the late 19th century, early 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois's Atlanta University Studies, for example, founding of the American Negro Academy, March 1897, bedrock texts such as Sterling Brown's 1931 Outline for the Study of the Poetry of American Negroes, Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negroes, Benjamin Brawley's 1937 underlooked aesthetic manifesto, The Negro Genius. You read these things, they're fresh as day. The Zora Neale Hurston we heard today, fresh as day. We would be lucky to write sentences that powerful today. These are just some of the texts of African American studies generations before it was a significant presence in mainstream universities. I don't need to tell you it's much older than 40 years. It's just been taking place at historical black institutions like Howard, like Fisk, like the Atlanta universities, like Washington, D.C.'s Dunbar High School, where black students were taught by some of the nation's very first black PhDs who were not hired by colleges and universities in the 1920s when they first earned those degrees. And so I'm really fascinated with how black scholars especially, and I'm looking at black women scholars in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, forged this discipline, and I've developed a bit of missionary zeal about sharing their stories with black people barely a generation out of slavery. Indeed, most of these first generation scholars were the children of people who were once enslaved. To remind us, my mother is a historian, and one of the things that she does in American history class is she says first, what do you remember that a grandparent told you? And people say this and people say that. And then she talks about her own grandparents and how she lived with 2 of them and knew all 4 of them. And she talks about the ones who were born enslaved. And she talks particularly about the one who was born enslaved and then went to college. And suddenly these students are spun round, because here this thing that we're supposed to be all over and done with is absolutely present in the classroom in the way that all of us have a very visceral understanding of things that our grandfather and grandmothers have told us. And so the project is called Cemetery for the Illustrious Negro Dead. I'll come back to that phrase. And it will examine both scholars and sites of learning as a way of understanding the dynamic in intellectual communities that we might call the virtual institution among Black thinkers in the early 20th century. How did Black people make communities and spaces with which to theorize their own history and existence when the mainstream academy excluded them? Scholarship has been a proving ground where African Americans have attempted to prove our humanity by countering Thomas Jefferson's assertion that we could do nothing above the level of plain narration. And so I think what happens if we move beyond the proving and operate from the premise that these Black intellectuals, independently but mostly in community, fundamentally altered our conceptions of what is worth knowing with work that's simultaneously reactive, generative, and quite urgently motivated. I call this project a prehistory to remind ourselves that disciplines are not eternal nor the same across institutions. African American studies, Africana, Afro-Am, not eternal or the same across institutions, living organisms subject to change. So that's what that work is, and that is the injunction to remind us about the archive. 5, present your work, and again, many of us do this, to a group outside of your comfort zone. It's very hard to do, actually. So for me, pushing myself in this way means that I don't always speak to poets or in cultural settings. Recently, I was very honored and very nervous to be asked by the Center for Community Change, which Dorian Warren serves on the board of that great organization, to speak to the big rally in DC about immigration reform, and to bring in the role of the arts and also link the experience of displaced African Americans from the Great Migration with immigration from outside the country, and presenting some of my thoughts in Spanish, which made me learn something anew, to articulate some thoughts, and also speak to people that I don't usually speak to and find the things that we have in common. It allowed me an opportunity to think about the social activism that I was taught very simply at home as a series of concentric circles, that the principles and lessons of justice that govern the home, then govern the block, then govern the neighborhood, then the school, then the town, the city, the country, the world, and that the area in which I work, language and art, gives me a medium. I felt so fortunate in doing this to think about what it means to have made a successful vocation in teaching, and teaching about the culture of Black people every day. For every day I see students challenged and enriched, their minds blown by the thunderous justice visions of James Baldwin, the word-by-word integrity of Gwendolyn Brooks, who wrote about the people of the South Side of Chicago, but also with her line, "Black is an open umbrella, we occur everywhere," and this speaks to what we've been speaking about today as well, connected her South Siders to an entire planet of people of the African diaspora. The village life of Zora Neale Hurston, which resonates with village life all over the globe. All these mighty visions in voices in the most exquisite English ever written. And so to be able to talk about, what does it mean for American English to be revitalized by and vitalized and to stay alive by the fact that it is a porous language that brings in other language, and that American poetry is where we see that most powerfully. So speak outside of your comfort zones. Poets are the ones who process the language and tap into the zeitgeist, who try in the small, beautiful spaces of poems to say, piece by piece, this is who we are. And so under the rubric of immigration reform, I include the millions and millions of Americans of African descent, myself, of course, proudly included, whose forebearers were brought here against their will and in chains, and built the nation brick by brick, and built the culture poem by poem. 6, buy each other's books and give them as gifts, or give them away. I can't measure this impact, but some of you in this very room might be surprised to know the doctor's office waiting rooms, private school auction baskets, airport lounges, airplane seatmates, hotel rooms, libraries, community centers in Ghana, Brooklyn, Washington, D.C., all the places where I have left your work or to whom I have gifted your work. you never know who will catch on fire. And I think that we need to the best extent we can, give our books away, because who's making money off them anyway? Thank you, my dear. Hi, babe. Oh, that's the baby. Hi, baby. Hi. Okay. You know, they say if you sing the theme song from Jeopardy, that worked. It worked for me. Okay, so number 7, we resume. Resist the triumphal black narrative. Resist the triumphal black narrative. I say this to myself because anybody who knows me knows that, in the words of the poet Lorenzo Thomas in his poem "The Price is Right," yes, about the show, he has one of my favorite lines in all of American poetry: "I like it when the colored people win." And that's his poem about "The Price is Right." But nonetheless, I think we need to resist the triumphal black narrative. And I want to give you a little interesting example from the great John Hope Franklin on this. And I hope this is something you don't know about. Of course, we know about From Slavery to Freedom, but there's another book that he edited called Land of the Free. Does anybody know about Land of the Free, John Hope Franklin? Mm-hmm. You do. One person. So good. I am scooping the black scholars. All right. And I think with the tale of this book, we can better understand the stakes of telling black history and what can also happen when the Negro scholar dares to step outside of strictly Negro subject matter and redefine, in this instance, American history. In 1966, Franklin and 2 other historians, John Cuffey of UCLA and Ernest May of Harvard, wrote a textbook, Land of the Free, which they submitted for adoption as the sole 8th grade history textbook in the state of California. In 1962, the state had mandated that history, quote, be taught more inclusively, give more attention to fair treatment of minorities. And the book, if adopted, would be used by approximately 450,000 8th grade pupils each year. When the manuscript was submitted to a panel of state historians for review, it immediately became the target of a right-wing book banning campaign. The book was described as being, quote, slanted in the direction of civil rights, having a, quote, pro-UN bias, being, quote, of poor editorial opinion with little resemblance to historical fact. It was described as attempting, quote, to make white students feel guilty over the past, and criticized as for describing W.E.B. Du Bois favorably. And the book was criticized for dismissing, quote, dismissing Herbert Hoover as a president who accomplished almost nothing, which I think is true, for casting George Washington Carver and Jackie Robinson as, quote, acceptable, and for refusing to adequately criticize Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. A well-funded Pasadena group called the Land of the Free Committee made a 22-minute film strip called Education or Indoctrination and used the image of John Hope Franklin's face with the Communist Manifesto read out as a voiceover. The committee said the book, quote, destroys pride in America's past, develops a guilt complex, mocks American justice, indoctrinates toward communism, is hostile to religious concepts, overemphasizes Negro participation in American history, projects negative thought models, criticizes business and free enterprise, plays politics, foments class hatred, slants and distorts facts, and promotes propaganda and poppycock. Ultimately, the book itself prevailed. It was modified without evisceration, I'm not sure how, resubmitted, and then finally declared acceptable and adopted for mandatory use in California's 8th grade classrooms. Nonetheless, many California radio shows for months afterward continued to devote hours of talk to the topic. The Pasadena film strip continued to be shown and debated without acknowledging changes that were made in the book, and some local school boards continued to resist using it. One, and you remember, of course, who was the governor at that time of California, one observer said, if Land of the Free captures Ronald Reagan's interest, all bets may be off. The right has demonstrated once again that it commands both ample funds and sufficient public relations expertise to conduct a highly effective campaign against textbooks that offend conservative concepts of patriotism. Most threatening, apparently, in Land of the Free was not only the narrative of the contributions of people of color, but rather the sharpest tool we have in African American studies, the critical consciousness that allows us to question hegemony and question solely triumphal versions of any text or history. This is kind of, in a nutshell, what we do, right? And that this tool was turned not to just black people, but to the nation itself. Is the American central narrative of upward mobility and power of positive thinking much more than a shroud for a frank assessment of the past and its ongoing unresolved inequities? The cover of the 9th and latest edition of Franklin's classic From Slavery to Freedom, prepared by Harvard professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, is worthy of note here. The book came out in 2009, the 9th edition, and so it's no surprise that the publishers put the first African American president, Barack Obama, on the cover. But in this image, the color, Obama faces a black and white image of the Negro bonded, a black and white photograph, visually marking the distance from slavery to freedom. The American flag is in the background, its symbolic glory and possibility restored. The scholar, Franklin, who researched part of this book from behind a screen at the Library of Congress, segregated from white researchers, faint with hunger because he could not eat in the cafeteria, has moved from margin to center. The book is written from an African American Studies department at Harvard University. The triumphal version of American history Franklin was chided for eschewing when he told the truth about American history in Land of the Free now dominates. African American history has been visually moved to the center in the image in the figure of the first black president. But it is African American studies as a discipline that teaches me to resist being satisfied with that cover, as well as to resist thinking that we ever come to a triumphal stop point, nor should we desire it. So I take interest in the fact in that picture on the cover that Obama's back is turned. His face cannot be seen, and so I think symbolic freedom is still in part unknowable. We are not, as viewers, given the satisfaction of smiling back at Obama, and the implacable faces he faces are not altered to respond to what they see either. Their gaze is notably skeptical and direct. The historical Negro will not be charmed nor cheered by the triumphal present. That looking, attempting to see things as they really are with the unflinching critical eye that is at the end of the day the way black people have strategized and survived is what's in action here. The will to the triumphal is understanding in African American studies amongst any people who have suffered more than their share of oppressions. But the lesson of African American studies is that the call to the triumphal is a siren song. 8, the corollary to resist the triumphal is to never forget, to quote Sonia Sanchez, that we are bad people. And to quote Shange again, remember, we were not meant to survive. Our very existence as a people is miraculous, and the spiritual strivings of black people to build a nation and a culture is nothing short of triumphal. So I hope we won't grow so cynical in our work that we ever forget that we aren't supposed to be here and free, let alone reading and writing and teaching songs of freedom to the children of slaves and the children of slave owners, quoting June Jordan, together in our classrooms. 9, the word. You see I've quoted a number of poets here, and that's just to remind us that out of privation and cramp we made, to quote Robert Hayden, something patterned, wild, and free, and we have done it with the word. So I'm excited by work like my historian colleague Jonathan Holloway's new book, Jim Crow Wisdom, which opens with Lucille Clifton's poem, which seems to me to be an anthem for doing black history. She was asked by the state of Maryland as its poet laureate to write a poem about Maryland's happy history. Maryland. So she wrote this poem. It's called Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes by Lucille Clifton. Characteristic pith. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. So I think that that's just kind of an anthem for us. So I'm talking about people who are not literary and culture scholars who bring culture, and again, we've heard this talked about before, in service to the work they're trying to do. So to shout out Alondra Nelson's work, Locating Afrofuturism in the Harlem Renaissance Poetry of Georgia Douglas Johnson and Jessie Fawcett, and later Gwendolyn Brooks. or Mary Patillo putting, this is before you even mentioned your cover, this was here, printed, putting that superb Carrie James Marshall on the cover of Black Picket Fences and reading it for us as she did, or Jafari Allen teaching black feminist poetics in the anthropology classrooms with the work of Audre Lorde as a guiding light. So a big shout out to the non-culture scholars and the non-artists who find the pith and the marrow of our experience in those words and images that made their subversive way into the landscape. Because what we are doing is searching for the sacred words. And so I will read here Amiri Baraka's Kaaba. A closed window looks down on a dirty courtyard, and black people call across or scream across or walk across, defying physics in the stream of their will. Our world is full of sound. Our world is more lovely than anyone's, though we suffer and kill each other and sometimes fail to walk the air. We are beautiful people with African imaginations, full of masks and dances and swelling chants, with African eyes and noses and arms, though we sprawl in gray chains in a place full of winters when what we want is sun. We have been captured, and we labor to make our getaway into the ancient image, into a new correspondence with ourselves and our black family. We need magic now. We need spells to raise up, return, destroy, and create. What will be the sacred words? So that poem was published in the book Black Magic in 1967. And just briefly, in this poem, black people confront the essential crimes of slavery and its aftermath, its sorry legacies in the form of black people once captured, not still sprawling in chains in a place full of winter, a place of closed windows and dirty courtyards, echoing the initial theft, the initial closed portals, the initial filth of the hold. And still, across the courtyards, across the years, across diaspora, black people are still trying to reach each other, make words, find words to become a revolutionary community that can in some way transcend its boundaries. Baraka in the poem reminds us we are a beautiful people with African imaginations, the indelible origins and sources not only of power but of expressive power, masks and dances and swelling chants that somehow carry people through to the present day. When Baraka says we have been captured, he is trans-temporal. Capture, he's speaking about the literal capture and transportation to these shores, but also to the capturing of our bodies and minds and the need to continually vision a way out. We labor to make our getaway. That getaway is into something ancient, but we cannot go back in time. We are no longer in Africa. So what do we take of the ancient image? What, is the question, is iconic and portable and useful to black people finding a way forward? How can the ancient image, which I take to be some form of culture work, it can come into correspondence with us and our black family? The family is no longer African, but black, diasporic. The answers are not easy. Is it magic we need? Is it spells? How to move empowered by the necessary work to raise up, return, destroy, and create. Que sera, the poem asks, what will be, both the means and the outcome? And then the only line by itself as a freestanding stanza is the final line, the completion of that question, the sacred word. What will be the sacred word? Where will we find it? And how will we know it? I think that's the work we do. 10. Remember the beautiful ones. Ishmael Reed, don't forget to feed the Loas. Some of us become ancestors far too soon. It's amazing for me to think that many of you never knew Lyndon Barrett, and I wrote these words for him some time ago, and I want to share them with you. I met Lyndon in September of 1986 in the front hallway of Bennett Hall at the corner of 34th and Walnut Streets in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. He was walking down the grand stairwell under the looming portrait of Shakespeare, the portrait we would one night completely cover with pictures of James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, Ann Petrie, W.E.B. Du Bois, and other black literary lights. My mother said, "You broke into the building?" I was like, "Yes, I did. I broke into the building." And then the next morning it was all black, and Shakespeare was gone. And then by the afternoon, Shakespeare was back. For one shining moment. It was the age, you will remember, of much canonical revision. Lyndon and I both entered the PhD program in English that year with master's degrees, having each written creative MA theses, mine at Boston University, a collection of short stories, and Lyndon's at the University of Colorado, beautiful prose somewhere between fiction and criticism. The thesis was titled Diane, the name for one of his great idols who inspired the collection and much else in Lyndon's life, Diana Ross. Lyndon had friends already when I first met him that day, but he looked up from his friends, all white, saw me, and walked away from that first group, love at first sight. Black love at first sight. For Lyndon, who came from Winnipeg, Canada, the Peg, as he called it, and then Denver, who had never studied black literature before, had never studied in a community of black people, which is to say with any black people other than himself. His excitement, the only black person he ever went to school with was his brother. His excitement upon spotting me had everything to do with that unprecedented possibility, and from that moment on, we were brother and sister. We studied that whole year together with 4 others for our oral exams, which at Penn was called the 50-book exam. It did not then represent a revised canon. Among many questions, what was that book, the one that about the little black girl stuck up in the attic? That would be Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. That's how one professor described it. And then said, and who was the book about the Negro who was invisible? The word Negro, So we were not, revised. For Lyndon and myself, we felt like much was at stake in mastering the master's tools. Lyndon was certainly the most diligent, focused, and plainly brilliant in our group. His mind worked faster and better, had snapping turtle jaws that held on to all that went in, and he processed what he read into spun gold. We completed our exams in the spring and were emancipated Negroes, ready to become scholars of black literature. We grew a community at Penn. Kim Hall and Roland Williams were there when Lyndon and I arrived. David Anderson and Karen Chandler came in with us. The next year came Jennifer Brody, Nicole King, Amy Robinson, Gail Ellison, black graduate students in the same place studying black literature in the 1980s. This was highly unusual. A potent and unprecedented convergence we still can't take for granted. John Roberts and Sandra Pouchette-Paquette taught us and supported our work under circumstances that sometimes seemed impossible. Herman Beavers and Mancha Diawara, when they arrived as faculty, were also part of the moment. I call all these names to remember, to say that it was real, to mark the space in which we were learning together at a moment where everything seemed possible for black literary study. There were few of us enough in the profession that we could know or hope to know everyone whose work was important to us. And that's how Farah and I first knew each other, studying at different schools at the same time. And there weren't but a couple of black girls who were studying black literature. So begins a sisterhood. Lyndon knew absolutely nothing about black literature when I first met him, not a word, not a syllable. No one was more excited to be in the presence of smart black people, past and present, dead and alive, than Lyndon Barrett. No one could have loved us more. Having grown up in the tundra as he did, I would listen wide-eyed to his stories of Vaseline smeared on the face before you could go to school and exhaust that would freeze coming out of the car pipes. Having grown up in a West Indian home in the middle of the tundra, perhaps you appreciate a black community more than if you grew up in the Negro metropolises of the United States. Here are some things about Lyndon that were true then. He was a vegetarian who fasted 1 day a week, every week. His mother sent him Guyanese herbs and roots from Canada, which we would brew, hold our noses, and drink. He was an innocent then, except there was always something hyper-developed about his brain. Next to him, I always felt a little smutty, a bit like a fast big sister, though also like a nerdy, annoying little sister who needed her big brother to drive her to the store. That was our yin-yang. I called Lyndon when faced with a mouse in my kitchen, and he stayed on the phone with me as I swept it out the door. I called him in the middle of the night when his mother's Guyanese potion started to do its work. Those first years in Philadelphia, he gave heart and soul without moment's hesitation to all he did. Black pop music, and I mean black pop music, not soul music, not funk music, was his great love. He loved the crystalline voices, loved Jody Watley and Whitney Houston and Janet Jackson and his cherished Diane. We went to see Luther Vandross in concert and screamed the whole way through. And in black literary study, he exhibited the same degree of fandom and passion for our field superstars. We idolized Hortense Spillers to an embarrassing extent. Every single tiny thing about her, every word she wrote, every utterance she ever made. She said the word, what's the word for a hat maker? Not a haberdasher.
Milliner.
She said, I have a milliner in Memphis. And we'd like faint. She would say things like this. We talked about Barbara Johnson, the late Barbara Johnson, her brilliance in the same breath that we would describe the way we'd watched her eat chocolate at a conference. We revered our West Indian Papa, Arnold Rampersad, and followed him around like puppies at the MLA. This is to mark for you a moment in the profession when you knew who all the black people were and when we could admit and did admit that these people were our idols. Lyndon was a fan in the same way that he was a fan of the music. Next to Lyndon, I felt like Lisa Fisher, Luther's tall and gorgeous backup singer, for he made me feel that fabulous. I remember the exact moment when he told me something I had written was, in his opinion, brilliant, and how much that compliment meant to me coming from him, and how much it meant for my words in the wilderness to be received. And we were embodied black people. Our brains lived in our bodies loved to move. It was all part of the same enterprise. Lyndon danced like he used his mind. That boy could dance. He danced with utter commitment. His dancing, like his mind, was brilliant, tireless, precise, dazzling, relentless, beautiful, and nasty. He danced like he saw his mother dance. He used to describe his mother, an elegant and extremely composed Guyanese woman, hitching up her skirt and dancing all the way across the floor, screaming. In dance was catharsis. Lyndon used to sweat when he danced, and in dance was communion. He was a demanding dance partner. If you were hanging back against the wall, he'd come and grind all up on you until you entered the fray. You had to participate fully in black life in his presence, in the same way that his mind left no small detail unattended. We were a devoted, hardworking, and loving community of black scholars aspiring to attribute to a newly flourishing field. We worked as well and as hard as I've ever worked. Within our community, one of our elders wronged us profoundly, and that wronging scooped a chunk out of Lyndon's very innocent soul that was never right again. He finished quickly, despite many obstacles, and took a job at UC Irvine. He brought a group of us together in April 1993 at Irvine for a conference called Contested Boundaries in African American Textual Analysis. We were all assistant professors: Saidia Hartman, Phil Harper, Jennifer Brody, Thelma Foote, Tricia Rose, Arthur Little, Kim Hall, Farrah Griffin. You were there, of course. And who else did I forget? There were a few more of us. Jennifer Brody was there, and I think it's fair to say that we all individually in some way came to Critical Voice at that conference, knowing that we had to bring our very best game to this group. It's where I first presented an essay called "Can You Be Black and Look at This?" reading the Rodney King video. And even in far-flung community, and remember, no email, none of that then, we were operating in community, and I think to our minds that conference marked us as a mission-driven generation. Life changed for him in California. He grew away from many of his friends in ways we still struggle to understand, but his accomplishments are known and indelible. His extraordinary book, Blackness and Value, Seeing Double, his building of African American studies at Irvine, his nurturing of graduate students who have gone on to do wonderful work at other institutions. He died in 2008, and no one I've ever known before or since reminds me of Lyndon Barrett, not even a little bit. 11, Archive Demography Redux, Cemetery for the Illustrious Negro Dead. There's a letter that Hurston wrote to Du Bois that I've been obsessed with for some years now, and I finally realized the way in which it offers an object lesson and some metaphors for the enterprise of contributing to the discipline of African American studies, and why our ancestors must stay present with us in some way, and that's what I'm beginning to talk about in telling you about Lyndon and here. Hurston, as you know, did not always get along with so-called Negro establishment figures. Her vitality and forthrightness was sometimes taken as unbecoming to the race. She had a keen pretension meter, and at one point called Du Bois a, quote, goateed, egotistical, wishy-washy, haughty aristocrat, and called Mary McLeod Bethune a heifer. In writing. But that didn't stop her from writing to Du Bois in 1945, and she wrote this, I just love this, from on, where you have your address, she wrote, "From on board the houseboat cruiser Suntan," that was the name of the boat, "with a wild and wonderful idea. As Dean of American Negro Artists," she wrote to Du Bois, "why do you not propose a cemetery for the illustrious Negro dead? Something like Père Lachaise in Paris." She envisions it on lush Florida terrain and suggests that Negro sculptors and painters decorate it with scenes from our own literature and life, mythology and all. No Negro celebrity, she wrote, no matter what financial condition they might be in at death, lie in inconspicuous forgetfulness. We must assume the responsibility of their graves being known and honored. You must see what a rallying spot that would be for all we want to accomplish and do. There one ought to see the tomb of Nat Turner. Naturally, his bones have long since gone to dust, but that should not prevent his tomb from being among us. Fred Douglass and all the rest. Du Bois replied bureaucratically and without much enthusiasm, and so the idea died. Hurston understood in profound terms the expendability of Negro life. She had a scholar's inherent sense of the need to preserve. She knew that black people could be thrown away and forgotten. I believe she knew that black people would be misunderstood and underestimated, hence her anthropological work, the will to see and know and understand, but also the very specific will to document, which is something else altogether, the call of the scholar who knows, even if she does not articulate it, that there is something fundamentally expendable and fungible about that which she wishes to preserve through loving study. I think of our libraries and archives in some way as cemeteries for the illustrious Negro dead, places where Hughes and Hurston and Wright and others whose names we do not yet know converse with each other and are audible to all who pay attention. Hurston imagined something it is still sometimes hard to imagine: Negro rest, the much-deserved proper resting place after lives of often anonymous service and struggle. The extant and evolving archives of African American studies are also such resting places, not for bones, but for the perishable clues of lives which we fervently attempt to recreate. And so then let's conclude with 11.5 or 12. No matter how good you were at whatever else you did, you also had to get with the music. And that's from Romare Bearden. What we do with music, and the profundity of black essence and self-expression is unavoidably present in our music. And this last bit is just a way of, again, thinking about what it means to work with ancestral presence. What it means not just to, in thinking about the injunction against the triumphal, not just to honor our dead, right, but to understand that we work with and live with and alongside our dead, the ancestors we claim. How is that a particular life force, if you will, in African American studies? How is that particularly something that black people have taught ourselves to understand? Felix, could you please play the Shirley horn? Wow, that was just like, thank you so much. So we're listening here to Shirley Horn and her recorded version of the song, You Won't Forget Me, and I'll speak over it for a minute. She recorded this song in 1991 when it was all but forgotten. She saw the song in a rerun of a 1953 movie called Torch Song, starring Joan Crawford, wherein the song was subbed by a singer named India Adams. Horn's recording of the song and the eponymous 1991 album it appeared on brought this singer-piano player into full flower of her comeback. I loved this song to no end when it first came out, so much that it eventually inspired me to write a play in 1995 about a black woman artist, a dancer, facing the failure of her dancing body and the end of her life with sorrow and regret, and the cavalcade of ancestors who came to do the crucial work of taking her across the water to the other side. Miles Davis was a mentor to Horn in the early days of her career. Following her study as a child from the age of 12, piano and composition at Howard University. She began attending Howard full-time when she was 12. She received, and what if we just all here decided we would write about black girl genius? Let's just do that for a few years and see what we turn up. She received admission at Juilliard, but her family could not afford to send her. She said, quote, Oscar Peterson became my Rachmaninoff and Ahmad Jamal became my Debussy. And she snuck into the famous jazz clubs of the U Street corridor of DC as a minor. She formed her first jazz trio when she was 20, and Davis helped her get a recording contract. Her career had a detour while she raised her family in Washington, D.C. and confined her playing to mostly local clubs. She reemerged and developed a new fan base in the late 1980s. When she recorded You Won't Forget Me, she asked Davis, who by that point had had as many lives as a cat, to play on the record. By the time the record was released in 1991, Davis was dead, and it was his last studio recording as a sideman. So if you'll listen for a moment, the horn is obviously Miles Davis, and I want you to listen for a minute to the drum. This recording emphasizes the always-alreadiness of his soft, ghostly horn, moving over the words, "You won't forget me, no matter who you are, with whom you are, you'll think of me." It moves the song away from a lover's lament that she will never be forgotten to a lover speaking across the line between life and death. The four main musical lines of the song are all notably delicate and spare: Horn's piano, Horn's voice, Miles's horn, and that steady drum line. That sparseness mimics spare and coded communication after long life together, the shorthand of intimacy, old marrieds finishing each other's musical sentences, knowing what the other is thinking, stepping in when the other needs to complete a thought. The drum, quite notably, is like a metronome or a ticking clock. Indeed, by the end of the song, it is even more pronounced, as though time for the couple has run out, but the clock ticks on. You won't forget me, and the expressive presence of that horn makes this a song about literally eternal love, and that which remains when bodies are no longer coterminal. You won't forget me is not a wish, not a command, but rather a statement of how people remain with us even after they have left us. And so, the black artist, in some way, in our great and mighty tradition, contends with death, races against it, writes among its ghosts, who we call ancestors. We listen for the silences, we make that art, we document. Don't forget to feed the Loas, Ishmael read again. And so, by making our art, and making our scholarship, and making our healthy communities, we feed the ancestors. We leave a little water and a little food at the altars we have made for them, and let them guide the work. We listen, and then we hasten to create. Yes. Thank you. Wow. I think we have a little time to talk, and I know.
I hesitate to ask a question because I think many of us. I said I hesitate to ask a question because I think many of us would rather just sit here with how wonderful that was. So, yes. But we are at a conference and we ask questions. So, my question was actually initially motivated by Jafari's talk earlier when he had his list of what ifs. You know, what if we began Black. And now it was even more, it came up for me again when you said, when you talked about a dissertation on scandal, because my question was going to be, is there anything off the table in Black studies? So you put something off the table, but I want to push you, not push you on that, but ask you about that again. And the reason I was thinking when Jafari was raising it is, you know, I feel many colleagues often, and I feel like, for example, earlier the woman who was talking about Afro-Latinos, and surely that topic is not off the table. It was just on the first panel. There was nobody who had been studying Latin America or those kinds of things. But I feel many colleagues who feel like their work is off the table, even though I, as someone who doesn't do whatever the work is that they're talking about is off the table, don't at all feel like that's off the table. And I'm wondering your feeling about the tension between us as scholars, about what people think is off the table and what other people want to embrace, and then things that you actually think should be off the table.
That's really a great question. And so, I mean, that's a little bit rhetorical what I said about scandal, I mean, and this coming from someone, like I actually wrote Madonna when I was in graduate school and invited her to come to Penn to talk about her racial politics with, if you can do something with scandal, then do something with scandal. I don't think anything's off the table. To me, the issue is all about methodology, about rigor, about simple things. I don't mean to sound like a crank, but sometimes I get cranky, like you didn't write the first book. You got to say what the books are that came before and how you're doing it differently. I didn't like being told that, but at the same time, I didn't want to be stupid. Who wants to be shown up? You've just got to, and I guess what I think is a little bit different when you're talking about Black studies is I do think it is a sacred responsibility. Really. What did it take for us to be here? What does it continue to take for us to be here? So we can't act like other people didn't say things and think things and know things beforehand. I think also, cultural studies would describe some of the work I do and some of the great work that I admire. But I do think that, like with anything, I say about poetry, for example, there's Baraka, who is one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, and then there are all of his poetry acolytes, who are mostly bad. There are some of Baraka's children who are brilliant poets, but guess what? Most of them are a little bit weak because most of them haven't read what he's read. They don't know what he knows. So how do you get like that? Well, read what he's read and know what he knows. You can do it. It's there for you. So it's just that kind of continual reminder that we are caretakers of a tradition that's moving forward. I recently was doing a big book, too many books. We've all got too many books. And so I'm thinking, got to do something about these books. So I made some really careful piles for some of my graduate students with really, really specific things. And I was looking at these monographs and thinking, these are books that are out of print. These are not the books that are going on Kindle. And these are books with very, very precious information. And so it literalized and made physical what it is that we're doing. Now you read these books and you'll do something different with them, but you need to know what's in these books, or more importantly, in the archive, or, rewriting the way we think of what the Black Panthers were all about, right? Ask anybody on the street, what were the Black Panthers all about? Well, you'll have a different understanding if you read Alondra's book. So too, with all of the work that you all are doing. The 40s are different now that we have Farah's book. Yes, we've heard of Pro Primus and we've read Ann Petrie, but understanding them, even putting them side by side in the same conversation. So I guess I feel, one of the things that called me to this work was that it was so exciting to think, okay, I could write the 5,000th dissertation on John Milton, right? Or I could write the first dissertation. Just the discovery that is there. And I think that because not everyone's supposed to be a scholar, just like not everybody's supposed to be an artist. Not all are called. It's just true. Most are not good at anything that is exalted. That's just true. I say that now, when people say, oh, my poetry, blah, 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 and I say it with love. Write your poetry, but understand that to be an artist and to be a scholar, it's a sacred calling. So if you answer that calling, that's serious business, and there are other things that smart Black people can do. So I think that's really what I'm saying, not so much what's on the table or what's off the table. You're welcome. Yes.
Do I have to stand? Thank you for your talk. I have a question in regards to thinking about my own intellectual development, and one of the things that I did as an undergrad was I attended NCBS, right, the National Council of Black Studies. And as I continued in my education, I would go to other kinds of organizations like that. Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, in terms of the kind of precarious situation that Black Studies finds itself in, right, where some of these programs are under attack, what kinds of support can those types of organizations give to these departments or centers or institutes? And then the coin, the flip of that is, what kinds of support can these institutes, centers, departments also give to these organizations?
That's a really, really great question, and something that I thought about and didn't get very far on, but thought about a lot while chairing, was, if you are at a resourced institution, right? Or if you're someplace where, like, for example, at Yale African American Studies, what do we pretty much mostly do? We create scholars. That's what most of our people do, because we have the PhD, it's well established, and that's what we're just supposed to keep doing and keep our eye on that prize, right? And so, and I think, and relative to some other institutions, things are relatively secure, although again, I'm really serious that we cannot take it for granted, because it can be, people say, oh, I got Frederick Douglass on my syllabus, and next thing you know, your Black literature course is out the window. I mean, really, 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 really. So I think that for us to simultaneously understand that as Black Studies scholars, we are a larger community, but we also have different sets of circumstances, different constituencies, and different missions. I also say not everyone should have a PhD program, because what it means to sustain that is a particular thing. If you don't have a PhD program, but you have, 2,000 undergraduates coming through your classes and going off to do all of these other interesting things, that must be done, right? So, I think others could weigh in on this, to understand ourselves as a community, but with different opportunities and resources and challenges, and to talk to one another, I think is what's really important. And I think that what we who are in white schools can learn from people who are in predominantly Black institutions is to simply have that experience of what it means to be in the majority and in the intellectual majority. Because I know that all of us expend tremendous energy doing another version of what Frederick Douglass had to do, of pleading the humanity of the Negro, and to do another version. I mean, I think that's why you can't administer forever. I mean, I am not made to give a tin cup to white people for the rest of my life. I can do it for a few years, but then I got to stop because it's sickening, right? And so I think that to see what happens when you're amongst yourselves, foibles and all, my people, is nonetheless tremendously fortifying and reorienting when you go back and sometimes realize, I'm actually not going to plead my humanity today. Let you figure that out. It's very important to do that.
You read the letter that you wrote to the administration, because you said it's very important to, fight the administrative battles. What was the outcome of that?
We won.
Okay.
But you know what? It took me 4 years. So I think, in all truth, that was one among, we all, right? I mean, we've all written that email at some point and written it over and over and over again. But we got the thing, but the point is, even though we got what we needed and we were able to reform our infrastructure and give it some stability so that we could do our work, 4 years is too damn long. And I think it's okay. I think it's an understanding that if you have a job where you get a paid sabbatical, that I'm perfectly happy with doing administrative work if I then get a paid sabbatical. But after a while, when it's not just like, what are you writing? People would ask, and I would say, email, and that was the truth, right? And even that's okay, but the same damn email over and over again, on simple points of fairness, that grinds and wears. So that's why, to me, the largest point of that is that we all need to just, take the groceries. And here I again, love my colleagues so very much, because there are many ways that my colleagues would take the groceries out of my hands and just say, you know what, baby, let me put those away. And that's what we need to do for each other. Yes.
I was really moved by your presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering the kind of ethic of care that you elaborated, but also the kind of pedagogy of crossing the bar from Jack Alexander's really powerful book. How do we make the leap to that vocational care, right? That's really transformative. And the narrow professionalization that now, in a moment of precarity, kind of defines the field.
We remember who we are. That's what I think we do. You know? I mean, I think we remember that, like, there's always enough stew in the pot. Yep. You know, and there has to be. There really, really has to be. And I think, you know, to me, that's just where, not just ancestral examples, but also the kind of communal examples are what we just need to hold on to be human. And, you know, that's, I mean, we've made promises to each other, you know, to remember we see the price our older sisters in the academy paid, some with their lives, you know, so it's that serious. It really is that serious. So I think we remember who we are, and, you know, also I think, again, to come back to the beginning of the talk, we bring who we are. You know, another sabbatical story. So Jonathan, we had a conversation at 9 in the morning, and my music was turned on really loud, and he said, could you turn that down? And I turned it down, you know, because we had some serious business. And I said, oh my God, I haven't listened to music at 9 o'clock in the morning in 4 years. What has become of me? What has become of me? Now, I'm exaggerating a bit, but you understand, you know? So we just need to remind ourselves. Or Jafari, I have to tell a story about you. You know, before, remember when we had the Yale Alumni Conference, and we from AFAM were giving speeches, talks to the alums. And I walked in and I was like, what's that lovely fragrant smell? Oh, I believe it's sage. And Jafari had been in the classroom before, smudge, smudge, smudge. Because, you know, we had to be ready for encounter, you know, and that was just very, you know, we need to remember what we know, right? And that's why also I think, you know, to go back to Jafari's talk, to go back to Imani's talk, that's also what our artists have given us. So sometimes just turning back to that can give us the very equipment that we need. Is there one more question, or are we done? Okay, thank you. Carla.